Have you wondered how a pilot can go from being completely lost at the bottom of the classifier to be thousands of the leaders in just 24 hours? What changed in Ferrari and Hamilton so that Saturday was a total revolution compared to Friday? The classification of the Austrian GP left us answers and new questions. On the weekend of the 2025 Austria Grand Prix, it could not have started in a more complicated way for Lewis Hamilton and the Ferrari team. What should be a key technical evaluation Friday quickly became a day of uncertainty, frustration, and loss of confidence. From the first minute of free practice, Hamilton met an almost insurmountable technical barrier, a critical failure in the gearbox. This type of problem not only represents a mechanical setback. In the context of modern Formula One, where every second on track counts, wasting filming time and training is a strategic catastrophe. Ferrari was forced to make a complete replacement of the component between the sessions, a task that consumes hours, requires surgical precision, and, most importantly, prevents the pilot from developing real sensations on the behavior of the car. This inconvenience could not have arrived at worse. Austria marked the debut of the first large package of aerodynamic updates of the SF25, centered on a total red of the car, a vital area that defines how the car sticks to the asphalt, how it behaves in fast curves, and ultimately, how it gives back to turn. This innovation should be tested in real conditions, contrasted with the wind tunnel data, and finally adjusted to Hamilton's pilot preferences. None of that was possible. In the FP2, already with the mechanically stable car, the British failed to find rhythm. His body language in cockpit showed discomfort. Your radio, frustration. "For some reason I have no rhythm, companion," he said bluntly. It was a statement that lit alarms both inside the Ferrari box and outside it. The Formula One community, always attentive to the nuances of radial messages, interpreted those words as a silent cry of technical and emotional discomfort. And rightly, the times did not lie. Hamilton was 9th in FP1 and 10th in FP2, with almost a second difference with respect to the leader of the day, Lando Norris. This performance lag cannot be understood only by the lack of confidence of the pilot. It was the direct reflection of a still incomplete machine in terms of tuning, without clear references of behavior and with unknown aerodynamic data. In addition, the fact that the teammate, Charles Leclerc, also had difficulties, although somewhat less visible, suggests that the improvement package brought by Ferrari had not yet fully integrated into the car's ecosystem. It was, in other words, a prototype on track. And Hamilton had to adapt to him without tools, without feeling, and without trust. The contrast was brutal. Ferrari arrived in Austria hoping to cut distances with respect to McLaren and Red Bull. There were internal promises of a quality jump. And yet, at the end of Friday, they had not only advanced, but they had retreated. Even worse, with a star pilot who did not find answers and a media environment already starting to question whether Ferrari-Hamilton marriage was really viable. On Saturday in Spielberg, it became an unexpected, almost surreal inflection point for Lewis Hamilton and Ferrari. Just a few hours after one of the most discouraging Fridays of the season, the classification of the 2025 Austria Grand Prix became an authentic claim for the 7-time world champion. What seemed like a day aimed at consolidating frustrations ended up being a sample of character, talent, and technical recovery. The difference from one day to the other was so marked that many in the paddock began to talk about a double life of the SF25. A decomposed and erratic car on Friday, and another completely more stable, aggressive, and competitive on Saturday. Hamilton stopped the stopwatch in 1:4.582, a record that not only allowed him to place room on the output grid, but also represented his best classification performance so far from 2025. Until that time, his best results had been 3 fifth positions in China, Spain, and Canada that showed some progress but did not reflect the status of a pilot accustomed to fighting in the elite. In Austria, for the first time in the whole season, Hamilton was again in the conversation of those who really matter in the fight for front stalls. That 4th position was a symbol, a flag stuck in the middle of chaos, a clear warning that it was not yet ready to surrender. But more revealing than the position itself was the margin. Only 28 thousandths separated him from Oscar Piastri's McLaren, who classified 3rd. And even more shocking, he stayed just 90 thousandths from his own teammate, Charles Leclerc, 2nd in the table. Those narrow margins tell a more powerful story than any headline. For the first time since his arrival in Maranello, Hamilton was truly competitive against Leclerc on equal terms. That parity was the result of a cluster of well-aligned variables. The evolution of the car, a change of focus on the piloting of the British, and above all, a fine adjustment in the tuning that Ferrari managed to implement to counter-relish. This performance was not the result of chance. Behind there was an intense night work session between Hamilton, its engineers, and the Ferrari technical department. The team reviewed all the telemetry on Friday, identified problems with the distribution of weights, readjusted differential parameters, and adapted the motor map to the particular conditions of Red Bull Ring, a circuit where traction and braking stability are key. In addition, Hamilton modified his input style to curve, adopting a technique more similar to that Charles Leclerc has historically used successfully in Ferrari. Stop later, maintain higher average speed, trust the aerodynamic load of the front axle to hold the car in the middle phase of the turn. It was a subtle but crucial change. In Formula One, adapting is to survive, and Hamilton did it with an admirable speed. The only bitter point on an almost perfect day was his last lap in Q3. Hamilton confessed that this final attempt was not clean. A small correction, a minimum loss of traction, perhaps a reference of somewhat optimistic braking, and time vanished. He himself summed it clearly, "My last attempt was not perfect. I think if I had completed it, it would have been second." That phrase encapsulates both the intact ambition and the consciousness of the margin of improvement. It was not a complaint, it was a message. The SF25 begins to answer, and Hamilton is already taking it to the limit. Saturday's classification was much more than a good result. It was a validation of collective work. It was a tangible test that the new aerodynamic update package introduced by Ferrari begins to have a correlation with what is seen on the track. But above all, it was the confirmation that Hamilton, even in its transition season, is still a main actor at the Formula One. Austria theater was the spark. Now it remains to see if you can light the flame. What happened in Spielberg was the result of a deep transformation in the SF25, focused specifically on the base of the car, the ground. And when talking about soil in Formula One, it is not a simple component, but the heart of the entire modern aerodynamic system under the current regulations. Ferrari presented a completely redesigned soil in Austria, a critical piece to generate the famous aerodynamic load by soil effect. This update was not an evolution, but a silent revolution. The previous design presented correlation inconsistencies between the wind tunnel data and what was then obtained on the track, which generated an unpredictable car, especially in the transition phases between braking and acceleration. Maranello engineers decided to directly attack that weakness. They modified the geometry of the Venturi channels, adjusted the sealing of the lateral edges, and redesigned the diffuser to create a more stable airflow that allowed the car to keep the asphalt stuck without generating sudden losses of load. The impact was immediate. Better aerodynamic stability allowed the car to maintain a higher minimum curve speed, especially in the intermediate sectors of Red Bull Ring, where medium-speed technical sequences predominate. This new balance resulted in a much broader work window for tires, something that Hamilton knew how to make the most of during the classification. Thanks to this stability, the pilot was able to apply progressive acceleration ahead of time, trusting that the car would not go from the rear, a key element that had been problematic in previous careers. In addition, there were other changes that complemented the new soil. Ferrari introduced a series of micro-adjusts in the rear suspension to adapt to the new aerodynamic behavior. These adjustments helped keep the car height constant, reducing vertical oscillations and improving continuous contact of the wheels with the asphalt. This is fundamental in a car with soil effect, where every millimeter of variation can drastically alter aerodynamic efficiency. The joint work between track and Hamilton engineers was also crucial. After analyzing Friday's telemetry, the equipment identified that the behavior of the car during the weight transfer phases, when the car goes from being supported on the front axle to rely on the rear, was inconsistent. With the new configuration, that load transfer was softened, resulting in a more progressive, more predictable, more reliable car. It is in this type of detail where true performance is built. The case of Austria shows that Formula One is not only a battle of pilots, but an engineering war, data reading, millimeter adaptation. The difference between Friday and Saturday at SF25 was not magic. It was the consequence of a solid technical improvement, designed in the Maranello offices, implemented on the Austrian asphalt, and validated by one of the most talented pilots in history. When technique and talent align, the result can be explosive. And Austria was just the first tangible test of what this Ferrari can become. Austria symbolizes the moment when the pieces begin to fit. It is not just about track performance. It is the external and internal perception that is transformed. Ferrari goes from being a team questioned by its strategic decisions and its technical execution, to one that shows reaction capacity, agility in problem solving, and, above all, a car that begins to have identity. For Hamilton, this classification represents the first tangible evidence that his decision to leave Mercedes was not just a symbolic gesture or an emotional bet. It was a technical, strategic choice with a clear purpose: win again. And for the first time in months, that seems less distant. But it is essential to understand that this is not a guarantee of sustained success. The challenge is now to transform this spark into continuity. The SF25 has proven to have a higher competitive roof than had been shown so far, but it needs to constantly evolve to stay in the fight in front of a consolidated McLaren, a Red Bull. At the championship level, Austria does not change the general classification drastically, but the momentum does change. And in Formula One, that psychological impulse can be as or more important than the points themselves.